This is a Lowell Observatory podcast.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Welcome to Slate, a space oddity.
Hello and welcome to Star Stuff. I am your host, Cody Halfmoon, and I'm here with some friends and colleagues today. Why don't you guys introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dr. Kyler Keene. I'm the Director of Technology at Lowell Observatory.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michael West. I'm an astronomer here at Lowell Observatory.
Fantastic. And we've had you on the podcast before. We've talked about Project Hail Mary, which is a book I suggest everyone here read. We've been on a few podcasts, actually.
Talked about The Thing.
The Thing, that was the one. That was my favorite one, our review of The Thing. And then I've been trying to bend your ear on a podcast. I'm really excited that you're here today. I find you to be a great science communicator.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, and this podcast, in part, in our kind of outline of what we wanted the show to include, was inspired by a talk that you gave. I think, was it Lowell 42?
Yes.
Lowell 42, which is a program that we give once in a while. It's an in-person kind of lecture of something, curious and wonderful.
Yep. Offbeat.
So when Kyler came up to me with this episode idea, that's kind of where my mind went with it. But then we thought it'd be fun to start a debate because I love the drama. So this episode is going to be an existential deep dive, as much as one can do in 30 minutes, on religion and science and how theology and astronomy either commingle in history or currently, or clash in some ways, and how we reconcile that.
That's plenty of time to solve all the theological
all the
debates.
problems. We'll solve world hunger. We'll get this going. And I think that we're, uniquely positioned. I know that we were waiting on this podcast because we wanted to get a variety of religious backgrounds, but podcasts are difficult to schedule, guys. It's really hard to coordinate schedules. So, but I think we're really lucky to have you guys here. You guys are both practiced speakers on this topic. And it will get personal because we're going to be talking about our beliefs, or lack thereof in my case. But why don't you guys go ahead and just tell me where you stand initially?
Me?
Yes, you go first.
So I call myself an agnostic. I personally don't believe there's evidence for God, but I also don't believe that there's convincing evidence that there's not God, right? I don't think anybody can know the answer. And as a scientist, you have to live with uncertainty. And so I call myself an agnostic for that reason. But I don't personally find evidence for God.
And I'm a Christian. I was actually raised a Christian. I was Christian before I was a scientist. Honestly, I would say I'm a scientist because I'm a Christian.
Oh, okay.
We can get into that.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting for me in my chosen career is I was raised in a church that very firmly taught young earth creationism. And yet I was never discouraged from asking questions. So I've certainly moved on from that sort of belief. But the idea that I can ask questions, theological questions, like God is not disturbed by my questions, was an important thing that I took away from my early religious education, I guess I would say.
Awesome. Okay. Well, and I'm a preacher's kid, and I don't think I have to expound on that. That's pretty self-explanatory. No, I'm not religious at all. I don't really take a stance on it. I have a very, religious family that I love and support, and I love conversations about theology. I read the Bible as a piece of literature when I was in college, and as a preacher's kid, I knew it growing up.
Still a bestseller.
It's still a bestseller. They were on to something, I guess. But yeah, I have a lot of interest in the topic, and I enjoy talking about it with people who are open to having a theological discussion about it, which I think is an important note here is we're not trying to change anyone's minds. We're just talking about how different opinions come together.
I think we all learn from each other, right?
Yeah.
That's why I enjoyed these conversations.
And what was your talk about at Lowell 42? Because we don't have any recording of it.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah.
So it was called Spiritual Light in a Dark Cosmos.
Ooh.
And so, but again, I'm not, like you said, I'm not here to convince anybody to think one way or the other. So it was just, I tried to present, it was called an evening of conversations. We had, I don't know how many people in the audience, dozens, 100, I don't know. And the idea was to I just laid out the spectrum of views that scientists have, from atheists to devout Christians, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs, everything, Hindus. And I just presented that, and then we just sort of opened it up for a conversation, right? And it was sharing what other people have thought about these topics and things like that in the past. So for me, it's really, I like to learn from other people. So if somebody shares their religious views and why they feel that way, I can learn something in the process. So it was a fun evening, I thought.
Well, and it's good, at least from a marketing perspective, to know, understand, and like respect all of these perspectives.
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, at least when Lowell Observatory posts something about like a lunar eclipse or something like that, we do make a statement, because we are on native land right now, of letting, you know, some of the tribes in the area know that we will be posting live photos of the lunar eclipse,
Yes, sure.
because it's a very strong religious statement
Right.
that they specifically do not observe.
Right.
And I think that respect, like a mutual respect there, is necessary, even from like people think like, oh, you're a scientific institution, but as we'll probably get in when you start your backstory, that doesn't negate curiosities or respecting perspectives.
Yeah, and I think most scientists hope we can be proven wrong, right? In our research or in anything. If somebody makes a great argument, I'm all for it. Convince me, you know?
Yeah.
So
why don't you start? Convince us. No pressure.
Well, I guess the place I would start is, given that there are mutually incompatible truth claims, like we can't all be right, but I guess respecting people's differences is, I guess, a sort of cheeky way to put it is everyone has the right to be wrong.
That's right.
So, I mean, and I guess in that sense, I said, you know, they can't all be right, but I guess they could all be wrong. Like, nobody could have the right, I guess, theological view. Has anybody seen The Good Place?
Yeah, oh my
Yeah,
God, I
really
love
good.
that
I
show.
enjoyed that. Yeah,
Oh,
it was
it's
really
so
good.
good.
One of the conceits was there's one guy who was, I don't know, he was on an
guy in
ayahuasca
Canada.
field trip who, you know, got closest to the truth. But nobody else has it. So I don't know, maybe that's how, you know, things actually work.
Well, I used to wonder, because I remember even when I was a kid in church, understanding that everybody in the pew believed in a different God. I mean, they really did, a different perspective, what was a priority, what was important, what wasn't important. And we got a lot of that when I was a kid, because I read Harry Potter. Even the small nuances, it was all very different. I mean, even in the same church congregation.
So I guess to follow up my point of, you know, they could all be wrong, I guess the next question I would ask is, does it matter? Like, if everybody's wrong, like, are we close enough? Are we good enough? If there is a God, like, does God really care if we get all the theological nuances right? Like, what are the important bits and what aren't? And I think for me, I would say I'm a Christian because I believe it to be true. I believe it's an accurate description of how the world was created. I think I'm not the first one to say this, but one of the most obvious doctrines of Christianity that is true is original sin. People are just broken and messed up. And that's Christianity's a way that I find very profound and convincing of how that is dealt with on sort of just an individual like interaction between people level and on the metaphysical level. Like what does it mean that I'm created as a human, but I'm also broken?
Right. Is that like the tabula rasa argument, right? Where it's like, is it that one? Or is it called like blank slate? Where it's like, are we broken or are we born pure and corrupted by society? My perspective is I enjoy the idea that I'm not meant for anything. It's a relief. So whenever if everyone's like, oh, we're not meant to walk this much. It's like, we're not meant to do anything.
Right.
Things just happen.
Enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's, we have to walk this long way and, we're not meant to walk or not walk. We just evolved this way. Which for me, it's a relief, and maybe that's just the pressure's gone.
That's a lot of the thought with like absurdism, like, Camus and existentialism, like Sartre, where they said, if in an absurd universe where it's not clear anything makes sense or anybody has the answer, you're free to live the life that you want, right? And you can still be a good person, of course. But yeah, one of my favorite quotes is André Gide, French writer, won the Nobel Prize in 1947. He said, "Trust those who are seeking the truth. but doubt those who say they found it.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that a lot, right? We're all on a journey. We're all different views. We're all different places in our lives, but we're all just trying to make sense of it. But when somebody claims they know the truth, that's a problem, I think.
So this is a good, I did have one major question that I wanted to ask y'all. And I feel like this is a good segue because it really affects a lot of the work that we do here at Lowell and that a lot of astronomers do and NASA is doing, is the definition of life and our search for it in the universe. A lot of it is looking for our place in the universe, but it's also a very concrete definition of life. I think NASA has two obligations for life. I think the biological definition of life includes things like they must procreate, which if you're born sterile, are you alive? So there's a lot of, inaccuracies. I think it's a hard thing to define. And I'm curious how that shapes your worldview, and also, Kyler, how a search for life might affect your or interact with your religious beliefs. If there's any cognitive dissonance there or not.
Not at all. I think I said before, I was taught that God isn't surprised by my questions. And so if we're asking that question, I think it's good to seek out to try to find the answer. And I like how Fox Mulder put it in the X-Files. It's God's greatest conspiracy, or the greatest conspiracy is all God's side projects that he didn't tell us about in the Bible. So are they out there? Maybe. I think I heard his presentation from a guy named Dennis Danielson, who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, more than a decade ago, and it stuck with me. He says that finding intelligent life out there would do the same thing for him as finding intelligent life down here does. It fills him with awe and wonder and appreciation at what, from his perspective, what the universe that God has created. So if there's alien life, it's the same as me, interacting with another human. That's a special experience. That can be a religious experience in and of itself.
So the thought that perhaps those beings would also be created in God's image, is that the idea, or
just that there are creations out there, so to speak, that we don't know about, and that's fine. That doesn't upend my theology in any way, any more than people living in Australia does. If that's still, to me, I view that as just another expression of God's creation and God's care for the universe and wanting to interact and relate to the creations that are in it.
And Michael, I'm curious, because I know you've done a lot of research on theology. And what have you come across any interesting takes on life and the search for it?
I think it depends who you talk to, right? I mean, there are people who say, if you wiped Earth clean and you let life and evolution start again, you'd never get a human being, right?
Right.
And so in that sense, how are we God's darlings or something, right? But then also the possibility of life on other worlds, I think we need to remember that we have a very Earth-centric view of what life is, of what life needs. And so life could be far weirder, probably is far weirder than anything we imagine,
Not
right?
carbon-based at all.
Or look at viruses on Earth and everything, right? Are they living? So I think it goes back to what I always say, uncertainty is an inherent part of science. And just to say, I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out, but I don't know the answers.
That's one where I would agree with you, that if someone claims they know, then don't trust them, because we don't know either way.
Right.
I'm certainly agnostic about, is there life out there? We just don't have the evidence.
Exactly.
There's, hints, or there's, ways, theoretical models that might cause us to lean one way or another, but we just plain don't know.
Right. Yeah, agreed.
And so I'm curious, I'm here to not test, but understand the limits of your agnostic view, or the, until you have proof of a thing, you don't know if it's one way or another.
Right.
Has anyone argued with you ad absurdum, there's, my blood is green and gold, actually. But that's not true. Is there any, where's the limit there?
You can, well, again, it goes back to this idea that, can the world be understood rationally? Can our 3-pound brains understand everything in the universe? I personally don't think so, right? And so you can make all these, arguments, absurd conclusions, that sort of stuff. But again, I think even in science, right? And I'll make this, which maybe not all scientists would agree. I would say that science is a faith too. It's a faith that the universe is understandable, that the physical world is all there is. That's a faith, a religion is built on it, right? And so I'm always prepared to admit the possibility that I could be wrong about any of this. So, I've talked with people from, again, devout religious believers to hardcore atheists, and I hope I learn something from everybody I have a conversation with, right? And this is where I am now. This is where all my conversations have brought me to, this agnostic point of view. And so even if there's evidence for something, a good scientist always remembers that whatever proof the science doesn't prove anything. And anything we believe today could be wrong in the future as new evidence emerges. And I think it's just really important to always keep that in mind. That's why I'll probably be a perpetual agnostic, so.
So I think one of the reasons I said I was a Christian before I was a scientist, but one of the reasons I've stayed a Christian, and honestly the evidence I see for it is that the universe is rational, and that makes sense to me on some version of theism, that God is rational, God created a rational universe. I don't see any evidence for why the universe would be rational, or why we would be able to understand it on there, not being a God.
But maybe that's the perspective you're bringing to it.
Yes.
Our little brains try to make sense out of this universe, and so we couch it in a language that we can understand. But the universe doesn't care about any of that,
Right.
I look at science. Again, human beings are storytellers. We love a good story, and whether we call that story science or religion or poetry or art, they're all attempts to make sense of the world, right? And so I think science is just one way that people try to do that, basically.
And I certainly agree with you on that. That's one thing I have a hard time with is scientism. I guess the belief that science or rational understanding is the only way to approach the universe. I don't buy that. I think in some ways it's self-refuting, because there's no way to prove that is the right approach.
I would agree with you, yeah. That's why I said science is a faith-based thing too. It's just a different kind of faith in a sense. But
I'm curious, Kyler, when looking at the Bible, is empirically, is that the right word?
Sure.
What I guess, because I know there are some people who read it, and if it's the written word, that is as it was. And then, I was raised Methodist, which is not that specific. So, they don't think that Jonah was really taken by a whale. They think that was a metaphorical story, as a lot of stories were told back then. And then sometimes there would be this scientific, this version of the Bible, I forget which one it was, Adam and Eve said that their sons went off and mated with men, and those were the humans that were already evolved on the planet. So that was proof of evolution. But then not all versions say that. So there's a lot of thought, obviously, given around making it work with what the written word. And so I'm curious, from your personal perspective, how is that navigated?
That's a really good question. I think one thing that science really just isn't equipped to deal with is revelation or miracles. And that's, science can't say they happen, but it also can't say that they don't. And that's just sort of built into my worldview, that if God is going to interact with the universe in some way, it's not necessarily going to be scientifically explicable. So I would say the Bible, to me, the communication directly from God is a subset of that. It's a way that, because we wouldn't come up with the God that I believe in on our own, God had to communicate to us in some fashion. And the Bible is, I think, one of the main ways that God has done that. And I would say a lot of the Bible can be very misunderstood if you approach it very simplistically, on either from the fundamentalist Christian or Jewish or whatever, or the fundamentalist atheist view. A lot of those two extremes have sort of the same view of the Bible. Oh, it says there was evening and morning, therefore creation was 24-hour periods. We know that's crap, therefore the Bible's wrong, therefore there's no God. Like that's overly simplistic. I think just like because it's written, you approach it just like any literature. We read the newspaper, we look at the front page differently from we look how we look at the opinion section, from how we look at the comics. And so just understanding the genre is probably step one in that process. Understanding that, the beginning of Genesis it's not poetry, but it's more akin to poetry than history as we understand it
Psalm
in the modern
is.
world.
Yeah.
Right. So there's poetry in there. We don't read that the same way we read the biographies of Jesus.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. My class, in one of my classes in college, did a look at Job as a piece of literature, which is, when I really started reading the Bible as such, which was fascinating. I mean, that was my major, was ancient literature. And I thought it was interesting. Because Job, obviously, there are a lot of things that come up in Job that people get stuck on, and it's a major crux of like, this is science, or this is religion, or this is fact, or this is where it's like pain and suffering, right? And I know we're straying from astronomy, and I'm just curious. In reading that chapter, one of the cool things is I learned that a lot of people believe that Lucifer was acting as an angel at the time because he had to get God's permission to mess around with Job. So I was just saying there's a lot of really cool things like that you can learn from reading it from a literature perspective. So I'm curious then, where do your rules of your faith come into play when you're looking at a text that is largely maybe some storytelling and maybe some, allegory?
So I think sticking with Job, one of my favorite of all the scriptures is when God asked Job, were you there when I created the world, when I stretched out the heavens, when I laid the foundations of the earth? And the answer is, of course, no. Like, God was there, God can describe it to us, but we weren't there, we don't know. So that, to me, is really a call for humility. As much like what Michael was saying, is we don't know all the answers. I think we can know some things, like I said before, particularly through revelation when it comes to theological issues. But I think that humility is something important, just recognizing that I could be wrong, whether it's in my particular interpretation of one. There are just so many inane theological disputes about anything, like recognizing that we could be wrong. Maybe, the scriptures aren't entirely clear. There's enough room for interpretation that there's other people we think are wrong might be right. All the way to the big things, like, is there a God at all?
Right, yeah.
I could be wrong. I don't think so. I feel like I have very good reasons for why I believe the way I do. But, clearly one of us is wrong. At least one of us.
Right.
We're both wrong. All three of us.
Right.
So I guess that's sort of where I would try to start, is with the humility and getting as many different perspectives on any particular, like, even assuming the Bible is right and is revelation from God, what are the people who believe that there's so many differences, like what, and it's just a matter of going with what makes the most sense, what the most evidence is for. And that way I approach it, the Bible and my beliefs, very similar to how I approach my scientific pursuits. There should be evidence for it. I can't just make up whatever I want.
Right.
And so I approach it in some ways very rationally, even though the foundation is not, I don't believe it in the same way that I pursue science. There are different reasons there, but it's, but yeah, I would approach it in the same way.
Well, and I think that's interesting that's both of your perspectives.
Well, humility, like Kyler said, it's really essential, right? Once you think you know the answer, you stop learning, and you could well be wrong. But the other thing, coming back to science, is I think it goes back to Occam's razor, this idea that the simplest answer is the best. And so for me, when you talk about Lucifer or something, I say, I see no evidence for that. Why would I believe that, right? And that goes down to different views, obviously.
Right.
But for me, it's always important to remember what's, like UFOs, right? What's the simplest explanation, right? And it all comes down to Occam's razor, which is an essential part of the scientific method, I think.
So the things that I have learned on this podcast I am, like, I wouldn't call myself like a devout atheist. I don't honestly think about it that often, but coming from that perspective and learning some of the things that I have learned, one of such things being like our episode about black holes. Remember that one? It was terrifying. There were all these options for like which kind of black hole could be, and then we found this evidence. So okay, that narrows it down. That narrows this down, and the one that we are left with is the most terrifying one that has 2 points, like 2 horizons. One of which mathematically, and I trust Haley. She was a brilliant educator. I still Googled it because that's who I am. And I was like, that's BS. And I looked it up, and mathematically there is evidence that alternate universes exist within the second horizon, just math. And they're like, it's just math. It's a theory, but so are the other ones. And this version of a black hole was also a theory. And now all of the evidence shows it. So, and that's kind of how it's been approached.
Right.
But in my mind, an alternate universe could never be on this plane of like reality at all.
The multiverse they talk about, there could be infinite number of universes, but then if you say we can't communicate with them anyway,
right,
who cares, right?
Right, because time doesn't work there, physics doesn't work there, whatever.
Or the constants are different values, whatever. It doesn't matter in a sense.
But the way that it mattered to me, I guess, was that I was so devout in my disbelief that then having the thing that I did believe in, science, prove a thing that I didn't believe in that way, I was like, I don't know anything.
Making it mathematically possible was mind-blowing for you.
Exactly. I was like, well, I don't know anything, I guess. This is terrifying.
But if you look at general relativity, like Einstein's theory of gravity and the idea of the universe expanding from a Big Bang, it's a mathematical construction, but there's many possible solutions to this. All but one, I guess, of which can be true, right? So just because it's possible doesn't mean it's
At the same time, going just strictly with mathematics, that's where antiparticles were first theorized. It's a mathematical solution, and it turns out that the math then led to the discovery of how the physical universe actually worked.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So the math is a useful tool, but whether that's realized in our reality or not is a different question. Sometimes it is, sometimes we still don't know.
Again, whether mathematics is a human construct to understand the universe, and the universe doesn't care about mathematics, right?
The universe cares about patterns, right?
Yeah, it's our painting, it's our poem to try and explain how the universe works, but the universe may know nothing about mathematics.
Well, then you have, the way that pine cones and Tool songs are constructed. There's definitely some sort of pattern that exists in the universe. And my mother's very religious. She's an Episcopalian nun. She loves talking about theology. And she finds a lot of interest in those kind of things. But she's like, well, the Big Bang, she's like, tell me that wasn't an act of God. And I was like, well, I can't. I don't think it was, but I also can't tell you that it wasn't. And also math is like, these patterns that you find in space, you find in the, the cells of a leaf on Earth.
There's a really good book called The Unfinished Universe by a physicist named Louise Young. It's probably out of print now, but you can find used copies. And she talks about the fact that certain patterns repeat themselves over and over again in nature from, like the Fibonacci sequence, from seashells to, the largest structures in the universe and everything. But going back to your point, though, Cody, I think for me, anybody that makes a claim, the burden is on them to provide the proof. And so if somebody says the universe, God created the universe, it's not up to me to disprove that. It's up to you to prove that in a sense, right?
Yep.
And I would say that pattern is to me evidence that there is something that has imposed that pattern upon the universe. And I think the Big Bang is maybe not the best example because there's, mathematically at least we can ask the question, what was before that? Is there cyclical universes? Is there a multiverse? The Big Bang itself is not to me the best evidence.
Multiverse scares the crap out of me.
But as I said before, I do think there is evidence, and the fact that there is something rather than nothing is evidence to me. Maybe not, obviously not completely conclusive, or you believe the same thing I did.
Well, you said exactly the thing that keeps me up at nights is the question of why is there something instead of nothing, right? And I don't know. And that's a really interesting question, I think.
Why is there something instead of nothing?
Yeah.
That's kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
And I think that, that doesn't lead me to Christianity specifically, but that does lead me to believe that there's something outside the universe that has caused the universe to exist. And to me, that's as good a definition of God as any.
And that's why if you read, I've read several papers and surveys about religious views of scientists, right? And generally scientists are less religious than the general population. But it also depends how you define religion, right? A lot of scientists would call themselves spiritual, not necessarily Christian or Muslim or whatever, but they believe there's something, right? And then others, I think it's like, I think a quarter identify themselves as atheists, a quarter identify themselves as agnostics, and then the others have different religious beliefs, whether it's traditional, more orthodox views, or just spiritual, however you define that as well.
And I think historically speaking, that's where science arose in a culture that was really saturated with theism. I think both in Western Europe in with Christian beliefs and in the Muslim world, it was science developed the way it did because, as I said before, the universe is rational, and that to me is evidence that there's a rationality behind it. And that's, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's proof, but that is, shows that there certainly isn't inherent conflict between religious belief, and historically speaking, the religious belief was a necessary component of getting to science. And of course, there's scientists who don't require that at this point, but that's how it developed historically.
Look at astrology and astrology, right?
Yeah, right.
The connection between them. But
myths are beautiful. I mean, and not just speaking of like Christianity, but I wish I believed in ghosts. That sounds. I want to live in a world where there are ghosts. Exactly. That sounds fun. Like people get so excited on this historic campus about all those spooky, haunted, this kind of thing, and I'm like, man, I wish I believed in that. That's fun.
And that's where I really try to have the healthy dose of skepticism that Michael brings. Is that I think it was Feynman who said the easiest person for us to fool is ourselves. And we have scientists in particular have to bend over backwards not to fool themselves. Off topic, we could talk about someone fooling themselves about little metal spherules they found at the bottom of the ocean being extraterrestrial intelligence. But specifically relevant to this podcast, like I try to bring that skepticism to my religious beliefs. Like I don't want to just believe in ghosts because it would be cool to do, or believe in God because it's neat and it makes me feel fulfilled and satisfied, and I don't cry myself to sleep in the dark because God.
No one would wake up on Sunday because they would. I mean, that takes some dedication.
I think it is easy for religious beliefs to just be a crutch like that, and I think I do think people do need a crutch because we are broken, and I think there's some reality to that, but believing in it just because it makes me feel better is not evidence. Like that's just emotion, and that's not evidence either way. So I try not to base my beliefs just upon that.
This is why I enjoy talking with Kyler. We've had some conversations in the past because he's open to this, right? To admit that I could be wrong, we all could be wrong. And so, again, I learned from listening to Kyler, right? And that's why I enjoy those kinds of conversations. And from you, Cody, I enjoy these.
Well, I mean, as confident as I am to say, like, this is what I believe, and I don't believe in all of that stuff, you best bet if it's really dark at night and I'm walking through the house, my footsteps might be a little bit quicker sometimes, even if I'm like, it's not like, so, once all the lights turn off, what do you really believe, But I guess any closing comments for our listeners?
As much as I just said, I try to bring rationality to my beliefs and not just believe something because I feel that way. I think also my religious belief is based upon a relationship. Someone could argue that I'm just fooling myself and it's, parasocial in the same way I have a relationship with, Matt Damon. I don't. I just, hear about him all the time.
Speak for yourself.
or maybe the guy from Supernatural.
Jensen Ackles.
Yes, that guy. Yeah, he and I are totally like this, only he doesn't know I exist.
Right, no, I mean, totally the same, yeah.
So, I mean, is that...
If only he knew me, he'd
is that my relationship with God? The skeptic might say, yes, I'm just fooling myself. But to me, I think the non-rational aspects, they aren't in contradiction with, science or rationality, but relationships are different from, like, I don't analyze my relationship with my wife rationally all the time. I'm sure she'd kill me if I did. But you can't say like, okay, prove to me that I love my wife, or prove to her that that's not how
it's toxic.
That's not how relationships work. So at the end of the day, I can have reasons for what I believe, but if it's a relationship, it in some ways it transcends just being able to be scientifically proven. Say.
Right. That makes complete sense to me, actually. Yeah.
So I would just say, it's a beautiful universe. We're here for a short time. Try and enjoy it, make sense of it. And as we said all along, be open to the possibility that you're wrong about everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think my favorite part of this conversation is hearing that you both vehemently believe in that. Like, I can be wrong and I'm open to it. And I think that's what makes you both incredible scientists, despite any differences in religion. I think that's really cool. And I know I've studied both of what y'all worked on, so I know for a fact that you guys are fantastic scientists. So.
And that's what's cool about science, is it doesn't require you to have a particular set of religious beliefs or really a lot of other external beliefs. The scientific method works the same way regardless of if you're atheist or agnostic or Christian or Jewish. And that's why it's been so successful as a tool for humans to use to advance, their health and culture and all that. And why I am a scientist is because it has these great benefits, and it's true whether you want to believe it or not.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with us and for our listeners of Star Stuff. We might get some questions on the Discord, and if you guys get on our Discord and ask any questions for Michael or Kyler, I'll send it off their way, and then maybe you guys can answer it for me. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next episode. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This podcast was made possible by our members and donors. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support our nonprofit in making more digital education like this available, go to lowell.edu/donate. Thanks for listening.